All right. Can everybody hear me?
Hey, Bob.
All right. So welcome everyone to Lessons Learned from the BC Energy Step Code. One of the things that we just wanted, excuse me a second here, I'm just trying to read my notes off my other computer. One of the things that we just wanted to highlight is why did we write a report? Well, we thought this was a very innovative approach to energy code development in terms of the collaboration that we had between industry, government, local government, and the energy utilities. And we thought it would be very valuable for not only the participants, but also for everybody in the energy efficiency community to understand what we did and what we learned from this. And so we have the written report, and this webinar is an extension of that. Today, we're going to hear some presentations from Robin Wark, who's the team lead for Sustainable Communities and the co-vice chair of the Energy Step Code, Zachary May, who is the director of Building Codes and Standards and is the chair of the Energy Step Code Council, and Renee Lazarowicz, who is stepping in here for Christine Drills and is, hold on a second, last minute swap out, is the manager of Strategic Partnerships, Housing Division, Office of Energy Efficiency for the Natural Resources of Canada. I'd certainly like to welcome everyone who's joining us this morning. I understand on Monday we had over 400 people who were joining this webinar, so very, very impressive attendance to this, and we're very excited to welcome everybody. And just noting that we have participants not only from Canada, but from the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. So welcome to our colleagues from down under, who I believe it's sort of 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning. So thanks for getting up so early to join us here. The webinar today, we're going to have about 15 minutes for questions at the end of the presentations. I would ask anybody who has a question to enter it in the chat, and I will do my best to get through as many questions as possible. One of the things that we are trying to plan for would be possibly a Twitter chat in the near future where we could address any questions that were of particular interest or any questions that we weren't able to get to. There will be a follow-up email after the webinar, and we'll provide some more details on that. Just want to note that we have 1 hour for today. We want to respect everybody's time. And so at the end of the hour, we are going to have to draw this to a close. And so sorry if we don't get to all the questions. And I just want to make a note that the content today is primarily focused on the development of the step code. And while the technical details I know will be of great interest, that's not the topic of today. If you have questions around technical details, please, you can send them to the team and we'll get to them as best we can. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Renee Lazarowicz, and she's going to give us a brief introduction and some background as to why NRC supported the publication of the report. Renee.
Hi, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to provide some national context for the BC Energy Step Code and the lessons learned that will be presented. So just a little bit myself, I'm the manager of Strategic Partnerships in the Housing Division of the Office of Energy Efficiency at Natural Resources Canada, or NRCan as we call ourselves. The organization helps Canadian homeowners save energy, money, and reduce their carbon footprint by providing tools and standards that improve the energy performance of new and existing homes. NRCan's EnerGuide rating system provides a consumption-based energy performance rating for homes, and we have Energy Star and R2000, which are government-backed standards for the construction of new energy-efficient homes. And so that's just about myself. Under Canada's building strategy, the federal government and participating provincial and territorial governments included the goal to work to develop and adopt increasingly stringent model building codes starting in 2020. And the goal is that provinces and territories adopt a net zero energy ready model building code by 2030. So this is one of a series of actions the strategy outlines to increase energy efficiency in the built environment and contribute to meeting our national GHG emission reduction targets. The work to develop national model codes is currently underway through our national codes process, which is led by the Canadian Commission on Building and Fire Codes, based at the National Research Council of Canada. As building codes in Canada are provincial jurisdiction, provinces will have the opportunity to adapt and adopt the model codes on timelines that suit their specific circumstances. BC is leading the way in Canada on high performance building codes with the development and implementation of its Energy Step Code. The BC experience is informing our national model codes work and also providing valuable on the ground insight into how to implement this approach. As a result of our involvement with the Energy Step Code, the Office of Energy Efficiency is also evolving its tools to serve the needs of code compliance. We support voluntary and regulatory initiatives for energy efficient housing through the National Home Energy Rating Service EnerGuide. EnerGuide includes a home energy modeling tool and a national network of professionals to deliver programs across Canada. And now also in BC, it is being used to demonstrate compliance with the Energy Step Code. EnerGuide provides a standard approach for measuring the energy performance of a house and offers flexibility to builders to meet energy performance requirements of the code, in particular in BC with the Energy Step Code. With our national perspective, we were eager to see the lessons emerging in BC well documented and shared nationally. We see it as an important opportunity to build capacity across the country for adoption of high performance building codes. So with that, I'd like to thank the members of the BC Energy Step Code Council for demonstrating such openness and willingness to share their experiences so that we can help advance high performance housing across Canada. I hope today's discussion is the first of many such information sharing events we have across provinces and territories, and I hope this information proves valuable to our international colleagues as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Renee, and we certainly greatly value the support and particularly the opportunity to be able to get the report out. Next up, we've got Zachary May, and Zachary is going to give us a 5-minute speed review of the basics of the Energy Step Code. Zach, over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Bob, and thanks, Renee, for that lead-in. I'm the Director of Building Codes and Standards with the province of British Columbia, so my perspective certainly comes from that of a regulator who is constantly trying to turn great, ambitious policy objectives into actual regulation and change on the ground. Often easy to say, and as my old violin teacher used to say, hard to play. And so the policy context that we were working within for the Energy Step Code was certainly, as Renee noted, there's a lot of federal government policy and direction around improving energy efficiency standards in buildings, which includes specific commitments around moving towards a net zero energy ready code in 2030 and a number of complementary policies and approaches to help support that transition in buildings. That's a big transition, but is broadcast loud and clear nationally around where we're going in the national code. And as Renee mentioned, each province then adopts a version of the National Building Code provincially. And in the province of British Columbia, for a number of years, actually, we've had different policy commitments that were similar to the national commitment. Most recently, in December 2018, British Columbia released Clean BC, which confirmed that commitment to move to net zero energy ready and a similar timeline in our minimum building code. So by 2032, the British Columbia Building Code will require net zero energy ready, almost passive house levels of construction as a minimum standard across the province. And most importantly, in December, as part of that plan, were specific commitments around what changes we're going to see in the building code in terms of energy efficiency between now and 2032. So with that policy direction provided nationally and provincially, certainly in my role, what we did is we reached out to every possible stakeholder who has an interest in this transition. And that's a lot of stakeholders. They're not all actually listed on the screen here right now, but what we did is pull together a Step Code Council to seek advice on how we can successfully achieve those policy goals. Given that the policy goals are in front of us, we now all have a stake in how we can pursue that in a way that's successful for everyone. And while we may have all started in different situations with different perspectives, the organizations listed on the screen there, in the end, what we found was some consensus around a clear technical standard that can clearly broadcast where we're going. That was a request from industry and certainly a request from our office and everyone else involved to make sure that we were really clear in regulatory language, which was really important with the Energy Step Code around where we're going in 2032, even if it's voluntary today. I won't dwell on the technical details, but the most substantial recommendation that came out of that discussion around our 2032 goal of net zero energy ready is that the building code in 2032 will be a performance-based code that will require energy modeling for every construction project and will require air tightness testing for every project. That's how you build a net zero energy ready building. And so we knew that's what the regulation has to include, and that prescriptive requirements telling people what materials they have to purchase is less important when you're talking about high performance buildings. It's more about how they all work together. And so based on those recommendations, this is the technical foundation for the Energy Step Code and is included in each of the steps under the Energy Step Code. So every Energy Step Code building in British Columbia today includes these key technical aspects. In terms of our roadmap and where we're going long term, for houses, the example that we've provided here today, the Energy Step Code provides not just that 2032 goal in terms of technical language, but we lay out the roadmap all the way from where we are today at the bottom of the screen, the BC Building Code, and then create step one, which is really about using those technical tools I just mentioned, energy modeling and air tightness testing, but built to the same level of energy efficiency as today's BC Building Code. This is what we call our enhanced compliance step, really getting builders and the rest of industry comfortable with this new way of building and measuring energy efficiency so that they can move up the steps. And what we've also found is by enabling them to try that out without having to change what they build, many builders are finding many of the houses they're building today are already moving up the steps without them knowing it. And until we measure, we can't acknowledge the good progress that's being made in the industry. And as you can see, we've broadcast that in 2022, step 3 in this case, 20% better than today's building code will be the minimum standard. In 2027, we're going to be going to step 4, 40% better than today's minimum standard. And in 2032, that leads us towards a clear roadmap with confidence that we're going to achieve the outcomes we want in 2032 of net zero energy ready for all new construction under the BC Building Code. The value of this roadmap, not just in broadcasting the end state, is that it shows everyone where they're going along the path, and builders can start measuring today where they are along this progress and find out how the building across the street was able to achieve a higher step and what practices are working for their projects to move along this line. As a regulator, really valuable because we can now see where the industry is at and understand what steps different communities are building to. We made this all voluntary in 2017, and we've seen an enormous step forward in the industry. In the last 18 months, in December 2017, we enabled voluntarily local governments to take the step, if they wish, to require or incentivize the Energy Step Code locally. And as you can see here, over 18 months, we've now achieved, while only 15% of local governments in British Columbia, I think there's somewhere about 180 some odd local governments in British Columbia, those 15% are already leaders. And what they've done, they represent 70% of residential construction in British Columbia that as of the next year are going to be all building under the Energy Step Code. That is an enormous transition that wasn't mandated by government, although we are saying in 2022, that's where we're going to be. And for those communities and now most of the industry, they will already be achieving those targets by the time we hit that next incremental step in 2022. The key for us, at least in regulation, was putting it in black and white, setting those clear targets, and then allowing local governments and industry to lead the way. With that, I'll hand it over to Robin. Back to you, Bob.
Thanks, Zach. So just a note for everybody listening in. If you have a question, please use the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen. Type your questions in there, and then I will go there once Robin has finished, and I'll read out those questions to the panelists. Without further ado, up next, Robin Work, and she's going to give us an overview of the key lessons learned from this process. Robin.
Thanks a lot, Bob. Can everyone see my screen? Yeah, you can see that front page?
I can see it.
That's as long as you can see it, Bob. And by the way, Bob, nobody gave you an introduction. So Bob Steeks here is also the co-vice chair of the Energy Step Code Council, a leading builder, award-winning builder here in BC, and representing the Canadian Home Builders Association. So here's a report that is just being released today that I've written with James Glaive based on interviews with 14 of the folks who are sitting around the table who are effectively the architects of the Energy Step Code. And we had an opportunity to step back thanks to NRCan's funding and think back about what are the lessons that we've learned from the BC Energy Step Code. So I confess that I stole this slide from an industry colleague who did a presentation last week, and of course, who doesn't love Mad Men? And the way he framed it was by 2032, every BC builder will face a simple choice. Build like Passive House, so that net zero energy ready building, or build somewhere else. Are you ready? And you know, everyone likes Mad Men, so that's why I put it in here. And you know, here's the cast of Mad Men, and you haven't met all of us. And I've got to say, we don't look much like this. They've certainly got much more diversity than they had in Mad Men, and there's many more of us. So we have 50 organizations who are voluntarily a part of the Energy Step Code Council in our subcommittees. And the Industry Association, they represent 55,000 members across British Columbia. So we've got terrific reach. But what I liked about this picture is this, like, we got this kind of look that they've got here. And although everybody knows that there's stuff that's going on behind the scenes, and it's not a smooth road ahead, that we have the team in place, that we have full confidence that we're actually going to meet our 2032 target. And here's just some pictures of some buildings just recently that have been constructed in the last couple of years here in BC, that are showing the different building types. And they're all being built to the middle step or the top step of the BC Energy Step Code. So buildings from north of BC, east BC, here's west coast on Vancouver Island, some affordable housing projects. And here's 3 big projects that are currently under permit in the city of Vancouver, all getting built to Passive House level. And here's a new rec center that's just getting built in the city of Surrey, which will be the largest Passive House rec center in North America. So one question that I often get, and work for BC Hydro, is what's the energy utility doing in the middle of all this, this fun here in BC? Well, we're mandated by the government through the Clean Energy Act that 66% of all of our electricity demand going forward has to be through conservation. So we have a big conservation mandate, and we're a big player around conservation here in British Columbia. And like other utilities across North America, and, we started historically in putting incentives together for consumers, but we found that those savings are quite small on a project-by-project basis. So about a decade ago, actually I can hear somebody talking. Is there a problem there? James, I'm sure you've got that under control. I'll carry on. So we went beyond incentives and said we need to be starting to work on the code system. So for the last decade, we've been working with Zach and others in the code space. But when our auditors looked at how much electrical savings we were claiming from the codes, they said, well, is everybody building to the codes that that's being adopted province-wide? And they declared that wasn't actually the case. That only about 67% of projects were complying with energy aspects of the BC Building Code. So they whacked our energy savings that we were claiming down. And so it made us think that we should perhaps be framing and supporting our work here in BC in a slightly different way. So we still have incentives, we still work on codes work, but we also need to be working on market support. So working with the partners who are around the table of the Energy Step Code Council, whether they're industry players, government players, etc., to be able to support this market transformation. So let me get into this document that hopefully you'll get a chance to have a look at. So there's 10 lessons in all in the document, but I don't have time to go through all of them. So I'm just going to touch on 5 of them. Let's start with the first one, and Zach already alluded to it, about how we pitched that big tent and really have embraced a shared leadership model, as illustrated by the 3 presenters who you can see in your screen on the right-hand side already. So one of the reasons we realized we need to embrace shared leadership is that we all have different superpowers. So Zach, as a regulator, has the superpower of actually requiring stuff out on the ground. But is that stuff actually getting built? One thing we found with a professional association like Canadian Home Builders Association that Bob represents is that they have terrific reach and credibility and ability to be able to reach out to builders to ensure what's being required by government actually gets built. And that's the same for other organizations like Professional Association of Engineers, Architects, building officials, etc. But what a lot of those organizations don't have is funding. They often get funded through member dues. So they're doing that work on a shoestring, which is where someone like BC Hydro, who has a utility budget around conservation, can come in and share in partnership. So effectively, through this model, we've worked out we've all got superhero powers and we've all got kryptonite, but if we work together, we can really move the dial. So here's an image about how we've traditionally seen code development in my observation. We know that we can build net zero energy ready buildings. We see them throughout North America and across the world, but our code updates tend to be rather incremental in fashion. We just see small updates around energy efficiency. And here's a quote from one of our interviewees for our report, which said incremental changes are so painful for industry. Whether it's a leap ahead or an inch forward, change costs time, money, and confusion. Just limit the changes and tell us where we're going. And that's what we've really tried to do with the Energy Step Code. So we stated that yes, by 2032, we're going to meet this target of net zero energy ready buildings. And perhaps you've done the same thing in your jurisdiction, had some strong out there target, far enough out that doesn't feel quite real, but it's a great political commitment. What we've done with the Energy Step Code, though, is provide that link from where we are at the moment from a performance-based perspective to different steps to get up to that net zero energy ready target. So a builder can decide, you know what, I don't like change that much. I'm just gonna, I just want to do this once and I want to do it properly. So I'm going to go straight up to the top steps of the step code. Or they might say, you know what, I'm just going to transition up those steps. And we as funders of industry programs and training programs can focus our support specifically to those steps in the step code. So that's lesson 2. Set your end game and then backcast out what your efforts should be doing and what resources you should be playing. The third lesson is all about change management. We have 7,700 builders here in British Columbia, and we do have a lot of builder programs that you'll see along the bottom of that slide there. And we've been incenting some of these builder programs over the years. Here's examples of projects that have got built voluntarily here in BC. But if we step back and say, you know, based on our incentive work, etc., how many of those builders are building above code today? I asked some colleagues, I don't know if you've got a guess, I can't hear your guesses, but here's what I got told. That we've got about 150 to 200 builders in BC who are currently building above code. And that leaves another 7,500 builders that we need to be working with hand in hand in order to meet that 2032 target. So this is not a small task. We really need to think about it as a change management problem. And we got some great advice from our industry folks like Bob and Mark Sakai here from the Home Builders Association of Vancouver. And Mark's advice was you really need to understand who your builders are in the province. You really need to segment the market. They're not all the same. So we certainly have our innovators and early adopters, builders like Bob, who's at the bottom of your screen there, who is building to net zero energy ready buildings right today. But they're a small number. That's the 150 to 200 that we talked about. Equally, we know that there's stragglers, as we're calling them in the report, who are struggling to meet code requirements. And as I say, we know we have a code compliance problem. But also be aware that there's a vast majority of builders in BC who are professional, credible, great builders who, if given the motivation, the market signals, and the incentives, can move quickly to that 2032 target. To have confidence and work out how we can support each of these segments. And so this is what we've done. The first thing was to empower those leaders in order to teach peers. So here's some videos that we've done, again, with some NRCan funding and BC Housing funding, where we've profiled builders who are building above code and then to describe how they did it, what technologies they used, what homeowners were asking for, how they sold it to their home buyers, and really gave some confidence about this is what we're doing. And these are builders who are very respected within the industry. There's Bob on the right there, and here's Nathan Stone, who's now the president of the Canadian Home Builders Association. So we're really empowering those innovators to be mentor to their peers, to teach peers, and to be a resource to peers going forward. They're also a great coach for all stakeholders. So those innovators, we've been able to bring into the Step Code Council. And, you know, I often ask Bob, like if I'm hearing concerns from one part of the province, I'll be able to give him a shout and say, hey, Bob, is this, you know, how much of a concern is this? Is it just an individual builder, or is this a real problem that we've got to address? And so these builders are speaking, and some of them are you know, different types of builders. We've got some who are building more specific homes, and then some who are spec home builders. We have different types, and they're able to say, hey, Robin, this is a real issue that we need to address, or I think we've got it covered through the association. So they're a great resource for us as we look at market transformation. The second thing that we think about for change management is how do we support that vast majority of folks? That's the yellow and the orange guys up there on the top bell curve. And a real leader for that has been Wilma Young, who's in the bottom left-hand corner here. She's just been a fantastic resource in helping builders get training. So there's guides for builders, there's a guide for designers, and then there's a whole range of seminars and webinars that Wilma has been coordinating the delivery of across the province. So we've had about 2,000 builders have been through these seminars so far. They're linked to professional development points. And Wilma's trained about 100 to 150 trainers to train folks. So we're really building capacity around training and delivery of high performance buildings. And by the way, if you want any of the documents that I'm referring to in this presentation, please go to energystepcode.ca where everything is housed. And here's an example of some of the hands-on training that's happening in BC to be able to support that learning for builders. And then the final thing for change management is we really need to acknowledge and support the stragglers as well. So they might be struggling to meet code. Maybe they just haven't been required. There hasn't been a strong code compliance in their jurisdiction. And maybe they haven't been on a building science course recently. How do we really support those stragglers, those folks who are struggling to meet code? Now, here's an image I took from a recent presentation I went to from the Building Officials Association. Building inspector, because superhero is not an official job title. These guys clearly have it dialed and don't have any ego problems. But Building Official Association has been a fantastic partner for us, and their role in being able to support builders through that learning curve is key. Here's Dave Schuler, who's the CEO of BOABC, and he's really helped us as we've tried to build an Energy Foundations program for building officials. So we've had a great partnership. We've been able to co-fund the development of this handbook for building officials, and we're also co-funding a staff person within BOABC to be a resource for building officials, to empower them with the questions that they might have, so they can empower builders in their community to be able to build to the steps of the step code. Now, we've talked a lot about builders and how we can support builders, but I just wanted to comment that this concept of change management is true for every field that we might be dealing with in the construction industry here in BC, whether it's architects, engineers, building officials, planners, or energy advisors. And what we've managed to do through the Step Code Council is really lean on the expertise of these early adopters, people who often have values around the work that we're working on around climate action, for example, and who are really able to put in those extra hours in order to help with that market transformation. And we really encourage them, even though they might be an early adopter, to be very aware of the rest of that market and to be able to reach out and tell us what's going on for those other market segments so that we can work out how we can best support that transition. Now, the concept of market segmentation, it's also applied to local governments. And so that brings us to lesson 4 in my presentation. It's numbered slightly different in the document, but just stick with me here. We've got 5 lessons and we're number 4 here. So this lesson is all about empowering and resourcing your local government. So in the same way that there's a different strengths and weaknesses or different ability within the building industry, it's the same for local governments. So we have, by my count, Zach, 162 local governments in BC. But they're not all the same. And when we adopt code, we need a code that's going to work for all local governments and all builders across the province. But in our review, in our work with local governments, we know that they've got very different capacity to be able to work with their builders around market transformation in this realm. And we need to acknowledge that. So we've got an innovator like City of Vancouver. So that's your green guys up here on your market transformation curve here. And in 2014, we had this one passive house, a project in the City of Vancouver. 5 years later, we have 80 projects that are currently on the books that are have been constructed or are under construction. So we're seeing remarkable shift straight to the top step of the step code here in the City of Vancouver. How can we use that leadership to support other communities around the province? So equally, while we have strongly resourced communities like City of Vancouver, where you've got high growth, high demand, they're able to provide good incentives to builders, we also have many smaller, under-resourced communities throughout BC. So where you have a building official, might also be the head planner, might also have to be the dog catcher in spare time. So it's very difficult for those local governments to really be pushing the envelope on step code update. But they don't need to. The bundle that we have is a voluntary tool that's available. And here's the latest list. I know it's out of date already, but we've got about 30 local governments who've adopted the step code as in the first 15 to 18 months of it being available. And really they're from throughout BC, a lot in the urban centres, but also we have like small mining towns on the east of British Columbia, Sparwood. And then our most recent adoption, town of Tofino, out on the west coast of Vancouver Island. So we have big and small communities who are all out there adopting, and I think we're moving from the early adopters now into that orange realm of the early majority. Is becoming a standard things for local governments to do as they're looking to push their climate action agenda forward. And I don't have room now. I used to have those local governments who are consulting on it. I don't have room. We've got another probably a dozen or more who are out consulting and talking about adopting it. So we've got a lot of activity here in BC. So how can local governments have the resources to be a leader? We know the City of Vancouver, they've got their own charter, they're pretty special. But what about the other local governments? Well, as Hydro, because we've been investing in this market support, we've been for the last decade co-funding staff within local governments, chiefly the medium to large local governments, but we also provide coaching support for small local governments. And so those co-funded staff are working full-time on climate and energy policy work. And then as well as working within the local government, they also work as peer networks on support programs. So we see a lot of capacity within local government to be able to try things, to test things, and to be working closely with industry. Now, I got to say that one of the concerns that industry expressed through the Energy Step Code Council was of local governments going off road. So if you give them the power to be able to adopt the Energy Step Code, what's going to stop them from saying, right, we'll go straight to the top step, we'll just require everything to be passive house? And builders simply don't have the capacity to be able to build that in that jurisdiction. So we developed a best practice guide for local government, which is a cracking read. You'll enjoy this if you've got some time over the summer, or maybe not. But it gives very clear guidance to local governments on how to work with industry, what's notification to industry, how to reach out to them, what's minimum time period, and how to get advice from industry on what's the right pace of change in their jurisdiction. There's also great examples of incentives that local governments have put in place for builders, whether that's small incentives like building permit rebates, appropriate for the lower steps, or some large-scale incentives like when you're giving a big land lift from a rezoning policy or a local area plan, how to capture some of that back to be able to drive energy efficiency. And that document's been very, very helpful as a resource for local governments and for industry. And I think pretty much everyone has followed the requirements in this document. I received one call once from an industry person who was concerned that the local government wasn't following the best practices guide. through our networks, we're able to make a call out, have a conversation with staff, give them clarity around what the guidelines were. They were very appreciative of that information, and they also stepped in line with what the industry had been suggesting was an appropriate pace for change for here in BC. Which brings me to my final point, the lesson 5, which is identifying and tackling cost pain points. Now, you're probably sitting elsewhere in Canada and maybe North America and Australia, New Zealand, and say, well, that's all fine, but you know, BC is kind of special, you know, they kind of, you know, affordability is a big issue in my community, or in my jurisdiction. I just can't see this happening. I just want to point out that affordability is the #1 political issue for us in BC for the last, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years. Affordability is a very, very serious issue, and we knew that we had to make sure that this did not become an affordability challenge for housing in BC. So we've been very diligent in trying to identify and tackle those cost pain points. So our approach was to use peer-reviewed, very extensive open book costing studies. And to be very, very clear on when they said there's more costs, who was receiving those costs and what was it relating to? Was it to get to step 1 for builders who aren't complying with code at the moment? Or is it to get to step 5? Now, if you're a builder who's already building to step 5, then clearly there's not a cost, you know, it's free for you. But there are costs for builders who are currently building a base code and then are going to be required by their local government jurisdiction to build to one of the lower steps. And here's a quote from one of our interviewees for the Lessons Learned report, which is, just as with seismic standards, fire prevention, and public health requirements, energy performance is not cost neutral. Rather, it's an investment in societal good. But how much is a reasonable cost premium over code? So we discussed with industry and government, and it was determined that when you typically have a code update, which we do frequently, it's a common thing within code systems, we look to have a code premium of about 1 to 2%. So that's what we targeted in our work as well. And so when we talked about how fast local governments could go initially, we said that in the first few years, if it's a citywide requirement, they could only go in the lower steps. That's steps 1, 2, and 3. If you're going to be looking at the upper steps, you have to be providing significant incentives to be able to help builders get through that cost barrier. And just a small point around cost. Doing nothing isn't cost neutral either. We have had significant fire issues and drought issues here in BC. We're experiencing it every day. In fact, at the moment, there's a forest fire that's burning up north of Vancouver. This is what August has looked like for the last two years, and you know, August was one of my favorite months here in Vancouver, but we've had smoke from the forest fire, making it very unpleasant to be living in the city, and more than unpleasant if you have health issues, if you're for the very young and the very old, or if you want to do exercise like go for a run. So we're feeling climate change very, very significantly here, and we know that doing nothing isn't cost neutral. Having said that, we are serious about our affordability issues, and that we do need to make sure that this market transition is smooth for all communities. And so there's a few things that we've been doing. The first one is to align our training with the step code. We know that one of the most expensive things for builders is that learning curve. So yeah, they might be able to build these steps and after the first 2 or 3 projects, but that first project is going to cost a bit as you're going to get your trades up to speed, as you learn how to access your materials, etc. So we've been really focusing on that learning curve cost, making extensive training available throughout BC. And we're lucky that the steps, oh, we're not lucky, the step code has been designed to align with all those builder programs. So we've been able to make great use of our partners within CHBA, Passive House, Built Green, etc., to be able to roll out this training. And then the other thing we've been able to do with the step code is to align our incentives and to be very strategic about where we wanted to be putting those incentives. So we've aligned our utility incentives, local government incentives, and we've seen a lot of it, local governments bringing forward their own incentive programs, and also senior government incentives aligned with the steps of the step codes and being used strategically. So we're not giving them to free riders, but we're giving them where those cost burdens are being experienced. So here's my final slide. Here's your plan. Here's our plan. Here we are here on our bikes in BC, and this is our target for 2032. But this is likely what we're going to experience. The report talked about our lessons, but I really want to emphasize that this has not been a pain-free process here in BC, that we're finding ourselves on peaks and valleys every week, every month. And it's something that we're determined that we're going to get through to get to that 2032 target. And the way we get through that is through our partnerships. You'll see in the Energy Step Code report that you'll get, there's a lot of pictures, not of buildings as much as of people. And it's really those partners, that ability to be able to pick up the phone and phone Bob, or phone the Building Official Association, or phone our builders up in the Okanagan, and be able to really share, like, what is the crux of the challenges that we're experiencing, and what resources can we bring to bear to be able to address this. That's really going to make sure that we get to our reality in 2032. And we're very keen to keep sharing with other jurisdictions as well. We know everyone's at a different space, and you've got lessons, I'm sure, that especially if you're in colder climates, that you can be sharing with us around how to build more energy efficient buildings. And as you take your leap of faith towards your net zero energy ready target, really would like to share that and be present to you as well. So thanks very much for the chance to be able to share on this webinar, and we look forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much, Robin. So we've had lots of questions. I know Zach has been answering a couple. But, they're good questions, so I will also pose those to the group. And just getting off, maybe a question for Zach. We've had a couple questions around step code approach for renovations, codified step code for renovations. And Zach, can you just talk a little bit about what the province is planning for that? James, you're gonna have to take that Zach off mute.
Although it's quite fun watching him try to speak.
There we go. All right, I'm back. Thanks for that question. As I understand it, the question is about the step code applying to renovations on existing buildings. And this is maybe a systemic challenge we've got with the BC Building Code, which is primarily intended for the activity of design and construction on new buildings, although technically it may be applied to existing situations. And so the step code could be applied if someone was doing a substantial renovation and had the opportunity to do an energy model on their whole building and achieve those steps. Although the step code really is intended for new construction, and under Clean BC, the provincial government and actually the federal government as well have committed to creating a code for existing buildings for retrofits by 2022 federally, and implementing that in 2024 in British Columbia for renovations, just simply because they're so much more complex, and it's really an issue that has been around as long as codes around how you regulate existing buildings.
And then another question.
Maybe Bob, could I just jump in there as well? So certainly we know that renovations are the big elephant in the room that we need to tackle. And one of the things I think that we've got the advantage here in BC is having engaged all the industry groups together around the step code. We've already got those relationships, we've already got those partnerships, but we're now in a space to tackle seriously the retrofit side. So I think that sets us up in good stead.
And there's certainly lots of interest from industry on exploring standards for renovations to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions from the built environment. Another question around, do we have mixed fuel homes, natural gas or space heating and hot water? And so how does the code account for natural gas use?
Yeah, happy to start that one off. The British Columbia Building Code, like the National Building Code, is what's called fuel neutral. We just focus on reducing energy use by buildings, regardless of the fuel source, whether that's coming from a solar panel on the roof, whether that's coming from electricity from different sources, or natural gas or other fuels. The primary focus of the National Building Code and the BC Building Code, including the Energy Step Code, is on reducing energy demand. That is one of two big policy goals in terms of climate action in Canada and in British Columbia. We need to reduce energy demand so that we have options on the table to be able to choose to make the built environment a clean built environment using low GHG or no GHG fuels. But the Energy Step Code specifically targets that first big task, which is lowering energy demand, whether you're using natural gas or electricity or otherwise.
Well, maybe I could just jump in here as well and say that local governments are very keen, or some local governments are very keen on getting more specific. And so they've been pushing us as a council and Zach as an individual around how greenhouse gases can be an explicit target within that's something that they can regulate. So the City of Vancouver isn't restricted by the BC Building Code. They can do their own work. So they've actually introduced a greenhouse gas intensity target and also a greenhouse gas cap for larger homes. And so that they're regulating towards that. So they believe that if you're aiming to reduce greenhouse gases, have an explicit target around that. And while that's not in the STEP code, there's a lot of discussion on how local governments could have the tools to be more explicitly tackling GHGs beyond just energy efficiency.
That actually is a good segue into a question from Leon Milner, who asked, can you speak to the difference in the code between energy use versus CO2 emissions? I noticed a big discrepancy in Edmonton between the two. For example, builders who build 20% better than reference house on Energide score, but only 6% better than reference on emissions per home per year. To hit climate targets, we need to hit emissions goals, not energy goals. Comments?
Thanks for that, Bob. So the question about how come we can have some buildings achieving 20% better than the code by one measure in terms of energy use, but only 6% better than the code, the example in Edmonton there, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions than the baseline code. And what that really touches on is not just the greenhouse gas emissions question, but the whole question around how you measure energy efficiency. Those who are familiar with the technical details of the Energy Step Code will know that we've taken an approach on measuring energy efficiency that isn't exactly like all the other programs on the market today. We don't simply require a percentage better than the building code. We require some energy intensity targets that are per square meter of conditioned floor area in the home. This is I won't get too deep into the technical details here, but what we have found with the Energy Step Code, maybe I see Robin laughing, which is my warning sign. But it really is a question of what you're measuring and really targeting that. And so with the Energy Step Code, we focused on energy use, and that's what we measured. That's what's being communicated to builders, and that's what the Energy Step Code's chasing. The carbon question is one that needs to be answered somewhere, somehow, and will require different measures that are also taking a look at that. But it's an important question for any jurisdiction looking at improved energy efficiency standards, and the value of putting it in regulation is answering that question. How are we measuring energy efficiency? Because there are a number of good ways to do that, but you need to pick one so that industry has clarity on how they can move forward.
Thanks, Zach. Renee, you're always welcome to jump in here as well. Any comments?
No, I think that's well answered. Thank you. Yeah.
All right, Robin? Anything further?
No, I mean, just to reflect, so it's on the agenda, as part of the strategic plan for the Energy Step Code Council, is this question about, carbon. And I think, our NRCan rep framed it well that, we've got these federal and these national goals like the Pan-Canadian framework, but the tools that they're using to drive those carbon reductions are all about energy efficiency. It's not about carbon within those buildings. And so I'm talking about operational carbon, never mind embedded carbon. And so there's a bit of a mismatch to some degree. I think it's certainly a great path we've got going forward, but there is an opportunity, I think, if we do want to explicitly target carbon, to have an additional metric within our codes that focus on that.
All right, thanks. And a question from Sean McIsaac for Robin. Outside of legislative regions, and I think you touched on this in part of your presentation, what was the motivation for BC Hydro to promote conserving energy? Don't they make more money if we use more energy? So maybe just reiterate what you commented on your presentation.
Yeah, it's a weird one for people who are outside of the utility business to get their head around. So we're required, so we're a monopoly here in BC. There's another small electricity utility, but we are the utility, the electricity utility, the major one in BC. And we're required by government when there's new demand that comes online, not just to build our way out of addressing that. We have to put conservation programs in place, and they're shown to be more cost effective than building new dams to a large extent. So that's why we have a budget and a requirement to put money into conservation programs, and we have to measure that through. We have a whole department here on my floor which is putting programs in place and then measuring to assure that we're actually meeting those energy savings targets that have been set.
Thanks, Robin. Question for Zach from Tommy Linton. Does the STEP code prescribe a specific U-value requirement for windows, or does the U-value requirement get prescribed to the required energy model? And so maybe just expounding on the performance path that we've adopted here.
Thanks for the question about whether the STEP code requires you to have a specific U-value or performance value for a window, or that could apply to insulation or doors. And the short answer is no. The STEP code doesn't prescribe any particular material or approach. It prescribes an energy outcome as measured through an energy model. And so however the builder wants to achieve that, whether that's by building a conventional home with materials that they're finding at their local supply store, or someone wants to build a rammed earth home or some other approach, so long as they achieve the outcome, the building code, through the energy STEP code at least, gets out of the way of picking and choosing the best approach for that builder. And that was one of the recommendations we certainly heard from industry was, we can build high performance buildings, don't constrain exactly the materials we need to use, because there are all sorts of solutions out there to meet different needs. And so the energy STEP code really does take a performance-based approach by defining the outcome that needs to be achieved, and then allowing, so long as you satisfy the rest of the building code in terms of health, safety, accessibility, and other requirements, it's really up to the builder to decide and their project team what materials they're going to use. And certainly at the lower steps, builders are finding some flexibility there to really find cost-effective solutions when they're not constrained with prescriptive requirements.
Thanks, Zach. So Robin, I know you touched on cost in your presentation there, but I think that this is obviously a foremost concern for the communities in the industry as we move down the path of building better buildings. So there's been a question here: has there been any investigation into the added costs associated with building a Step 5 building? Do you believe that these added costs will stunt the growth of developments in BC and drive the developers elsewhere?
Sure. Maybe I'll turn this to Zach. Zach, you've been in charge of the coal costing question. I should just say, for organizationally, we have a technical working group, technical subcommittee of the STEP code, which has got like 30 or 40 members, including industry folks, utility folks, government folks, really analyzing this. So Zach, maybe you can walk through the approach that's been used.
And sorry, Bob, I wasn't actually able to totally hear the question. This is related to costing, but
yeah, can you hear me? I just got a note.
Yes, much better.
So the question was, do we feel that the increased cost for, say, Step 5 buildings will stunt growth and drive the development industry to go somewhere else?
At this point in time, we can't say. Our focus right now is on moving towards that goal. And what we have seen is there are some builders today in the market building to Step 5 already for their own reasons. We know that by 2032, we need to get there. And there is no question from a social good perspective, which is what the province of British Columbia needs to represent. We need to achieve those energy efficiency outcomes and our social outcomes, providing housing to British Columbians, the kind of housing they need without major disruptions to the economy. And that's where we've heard from industry that if we give them enough time, we can find cost-effective solutions and move towards that goal in an effective way. It's too early today to say exactly what a Step 5 house will cost for everyone in the future. What I can say is that we are finding cost-effective solutions, and we are finding challenges that we're working on collaboratively to resolve. I can't imagine that step 5 would be implemented in 2032 if it meant a total stop to construction. It is the largest contributor to our provincial GDP, and that is not lost on the province. But we truly believe that there's a pathway that is beneficial for the construction industry, like removing the regulatory barriers that I'd mentioned with performance-based code, and achieves the policy outcomes we're after, in this case, improved energy efficiency, which is also a benefit to homeowners. So we think there is a solution that exists out there that improves energy efficiency while keeping the economy going, especially the construction sector.
And this is, one of the key benefits of messaging a stepped approach to energy efficiency is it really is driving innovation within the industry. And in fact, there's evidence that's suggesting that capital investment in the province of British Columbia in anticipation of higher performing buildings has been significant. And we're seeing things like vacuum insulated glazing units being tested that would give us, say, an R15 window. So, certainly from my perspective, there's a hope that technology is going to provide cost-effective solutions to getting us to that better built house. Question from Hansel Menzies. Our firm works with local Indigenous communities. How does the building code and energy step code affect those communities? Who wants to take that one?
Thanks. So the question about applying the energy step code in Indigenous communities in the building code generally really depends on the situation. Treaty First Nations, as I understand, do use the BC building code. And certainly there's a number of organizations that have been helping to see whether what we've done in the energy step code could be applied as it is or with some modifications in different Indigenous communities. And that's certainly something we're very interested in helping to support. It's not something that certainly would be imposed on communities, Indigenous communities in particular, that set their own building standards. But many may choose to use the BC building code and may choose to use the energy step code where that works for them.
And I should just say, Bob, that we've just started up a new group here at Hydro, specifically around partnerships with Indigenous communities around this market transformation. So if there are Indigenous communities who are interested in how this applies in their jurisdictions, feel free to reach out and we can connect you with the right folks.
I'm getting a lot of messages that my voice is somewhat muffled, so hopefully this is a little bit better as I hold my microphone a little closer to my mouth. We've got time for a couple more questions here from Nick Henderson. What exactly is the rule for designers who want to do their own energy modeling? Can the designer become a registered energy advisor, design the building, model it, and see it through the testing process? If not, what is the limit? Thanks.
Thanks. So the requirements in the building code, there are a lot of different pathways that provide quite a bit of flexibility for different people to do energy modeling. What we're seeing most commonly with Part 9 construction, as with our single family home development and wood frame residential construction, is the energy step code specifically allows energy advisors that are in good standing with Natural Resources Canada to do energy modeling. And that's the bulk of the energy modeling that we see for wood frame construction. That's also consistent with programs like Build Green, R2000, Energy Star that are built on that EnerGuide rating system. However, there are also ways where you can have different technologists or architects or engineers doing energy modeling as well, and there's nothing preventing someone from getting that training and getting into energy modeling. As you pointed out, Bob, these kinds of shifts in regulation indicate new opportunities economically for people, and the regulation leaves it pretty open around who can do energy modeling. However, local governments do have some administrative requirements that tend to make it a lot quicker and smoother for those that are coming with appropriate credentials and can show third-party oversight, which is quite common with energy modeling if you're doing voluntary programs, but isn't required in the building code. So always worth checking with your local government around what their expectations are and if they have different processes for different individuals who might be doing energy modeling.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Our time is now up. It's 12:30. So sorry to those questions that we were unable to answer. As I noted in my introduction, we're going to try and create a bit of a Twitter chat here where we could get some more engaged discussion on some of the questions that we have missed. So stay tuned for some follow-up emails on that. Thanks very much to Renee, Zach, and Robin, and to James Glaive for organizing what I think has been a very successful WebEx. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.